The silk sheets felt like prison bars against Grace's skin. She sat up in the king-sized bed, her heart racing as she took in the unfamiliar room. Floor-to-ceiling windows showed a city view from what had to be the 40th floor. The bedroom was bigger than her entire apartment, decorated in shades of gray and white that screamed expensive taste. A crystal chandelier hung overhead, casting rainbows across walls that probably cost more than her yearly salary. But none of that mattered because the door was locked. Grace had already tried it twice since waking up 10 minutes ago. The heavy wooden door didn't even rattle when she pulled on the ornate silver handle. She was trapped, and the man responsible was probably downstairs making business calls like keeping a woman prisoner was just another Tuesday morning task. Julian Sterling. She should have known better. 3 days ago, she thought he was her knight in shining armor. A billionaire CEO who found her freezing at a bus stop and offered to help. Now she realized she'd been fooled by his handsome face and expensive suit. The man who owned half the medical companies in the state had decided she belonged to him, and apparently billionaires were used to getting what they wanted. Grace wrapped the silk robe around herself and walked to the window. The city stretched out below her like a map, cars moving like tiny ants between the buildings. Somewhere down there was her real life, her tiny apartment, her job at City General Hospital, her freedom. All of it felt like another world from this golden cage. The soft click of a lock made her spin around. Julian stood in the doorway, looking perfectly put together in a navy business suit. His dark hair was styled just right, and his green eyes showed the same intensity that had first caught her attention. He was holding a silver tray with what smelled like fresh coffee and warm pastries. "Good morning, Grace," he said, his voice warm like they were old friends instead of captor and prisoner. "I brought you breakfast. Let me go." The words came out sharper than she intended, but Grace didn't care. "Whatever game you're playing, I'm done with it." Julian set the tray on a small table near the window and turned to face her completely. He didn't look angry or surprised by her demand. If anything, he looked sad, which somehow made everything worse. "It's not a game," he said quietly. "And I'm not keeping you here to hurt you." "Then why?" Grace crossed her arms over her chest, trying to ignore how the morning light made his eyes look even greener. "Why lock me in here? Why not let me go home?" "Because home isn't safe for you anymore." Julian moved closer but stopped when Grace took a step back. "Grace, there are things you don't understand about what happened 3 nights ago. Things I should have explained before, but I was trying to protect you from the truth." "What truth?" Grace's voice was getting louder, but she didn't care if the whole building heard her. "That you're crazy? That you think you can just take people and keep them like pets?" Pain flashed across Julian's face, but he didn't defend himself. Instead, he pulled out his phone and touched the screen a few times before holding it out to her. "Look at this," he said. "Please." Grace wanted to refuse, wanted to turn away and demand he unlock the door right now. But something in his voice made her take the phone. The screen showed a security video from outside her apartment building. The timestamp said it was from yesterday morning. In the grainy footage, she could see a man standing across the street from her building. He was wearing a baseball cap pulled low, but when he turned toward the camera, Grace felt her blood turn cold. Tommy. Her ex-boyfriend who she'd broken up with 6 months ago. The same Tommy who had been sending increasingly angry texts and showing up at her work until she'd had to get a restraining order. "He's been there every day since Tuesday," Julian said softly. "My security team has been watching him. Yesterday he tried to get into your building." The doorman stopped him, but Grace, he had lock-picking tools and a bag full of things I don't think you want to know about. Grace stared at the phone screen, watching Tommy pace back and forth like a predator waiting for prey. She hadn't seen him in weeks. She'd thought maybe he'd finally given up and moved on. The restraining order was supposed to keep him away, but clearly, a piece of paper didn't mean much to someone who was determined to ignore it. "This doesn't give you the right to kidnap me," she said, but her voice sounded weaker now. "You're right," Julian agreed, taking his phone back. "It doesn't. But Grace, you have to understand the moment you got in my car 3 nights ago, you became a target. Not just from Tommy but from people in my world who might want to hurt you to get to me." "Your world?" Grace shook her head. "You mean your business?" "Julian, I'm a nurse. I work 12-hour shifts and eat ramen noodles for dinner. Nobody cares about me enough to use me against anyone. I care about you." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning Grace wasn't ready to face. "And that makes you important to people who want to hurt me." Grace felt the fight drain out of her all at once. She sank onto the edge of the bed, trying to process everything Julian was telling her. 3 days ago she'd been worried about paying rent and picking up extra shifts. Now she was apparently caught in some kind of dangerous game she didn't understand. "I need to call my job," she said finally. "They'll think I just disappeared." "Already taken care of," Julian said gently. "I called Tuesday morning and told them you had a family emergency and would be out for the rest of the week." "You called my job?" Grace's anger flared back up. "Julian, you can't just make decisions about my life." "You're right," he said again. "I overstepped. But Grace, I was trying to buy us time to figure this out safely." "There is no us," Grace snapped. "We don't even know each other. You picked me up at a bus stop and now you think you own me?" Julian flinched like she'd slapped him. For a moment, the confident businessman mask slipped, and Grace saw something raw and hurt in his expression. "That's not what this is," he said quietly. "Grace, I know how this looks. I know you must think I'm some kind of monster. But everything I'm doing is to keep you safe." "Then prove it," Grace challenged. "Show me I'm not a prisoner here. Let me walk out that door right now." Julian stared at her for a long moment, and Grace could see him struggling with her request. Finally he pulled out his phone again and made a quick call. "James? Yes, I need you to unlock the guest suite door." "No, it's fine." "Yes, I'm sure." The soft click of the lock disengaging echoed through the room. Julian gestured toward the door. "You're free to go," he said. "But Grace, please. Let me show you the rest of the security footage first. Let me explain what you're walking into if you leave here." Grace stood up slowly, testing whether this was another trick. She walked to the door and turned the handle. It opened easily into a hallway that was just as luxurious as the bedroom. She could see elevator doors at the end of the hall, freedom just a few steps away. But she didn't take those steps. Something in Julian's voice, the pain in his eyes when she'd accused him of thinking he owned her, made her pause. "You have 10 minutes, she said, turning back to face him. "Explain everything." "And Julian? If I think you're lying to me about any of it, I'm walking out of here and you'll never see me again." Julian nodded, relief visible on his face. "Thank you. That's all I'm asking, for a chance to tell you the truth." As Grace settled back onto the edge of the bed, she wondered if she was making a mistake. 10 minutes to hear Julian's side of the story. 10 minutes to decide if she was looking at a man trying to protect her or a man who was very good at making his obsession sound like love. Either way, she was about to find out which Julian Sterling was the real one. The rain felt like ice needles against Grace's skin as she stood at the empty bus stop. The last bus of the night had pulled away 10 minutes ago, its taillights disappearing into the darkness like her last hope of getting home without spending money she didn't have on a taxi. Her scrubs were soaked through despite her rain jacket, and her feet ached from pulling a double shift at City General Hospital. 16 hours of running between patient rooms, dealing with understaffed floors and overcrowded emergency departments. The kind of day that made her question why she'd ever wanted to become a nurse in the first place. Grace checked her phone again, hoping maybe the bus schedule was wrong. The screen showed 11:47 p.m. and a text from her roommate saying she was staying at her boyfriend's place for the night. No help there. Grace's bank account couldn't handle a $40 taxi ride, not when rent was due in 3 days and her last paycheck had been smaller than expected thanks to the hospital cutting overtime hours. The street was mostly empty except for a few cars passing by, their drivers warm and dry while she stood there like a drowned cat. The rain was getting heavier, drumming against the metal roof of the bus stop shelter that provided almost no protection from the wind-driven drops. Grace was about to give up and start the 2-hour walk home when a sleek black car pulled up to the curb in front of her. The windows were tinted dark, and for a moment she tensed, thinking about all the safety warnings about getting into cars with strangers. But then the driver's side door opened, and a man stepped out into the rain. He was tall, probably in his early 30s, with dark hair that was getting soaked as he stood there looking at her. His suit probably cost more than Grace made in a month, and he moved with the kind of confidence that came from never having to worry about missing the last bus home. "Are you all right?" he called over the sound of the rain. Grace hesitated. She'd lived in the city long enough to be suspicious of men who stopped their expensive cars to talk to women alone at night. But something about his voice seemed genuinely concerned rather than predatory. "I'm fine," she called back, which was obviously a lie since she was standing in a downpour at midnight looking like she'd been swimming in her clothes. The man walked closer, and Grace could see his face more clearly under the streetlight. He had green eyes and sharp features that belonged in a magazine rather than on a random city street. When he smiled, it was warm and didn't set off any of her internal warning bells. "You don't look fine," he said gently. "You look cold and wet and like you've been standing here for a while." "Missed my bus," Grace admitted, wrapping her arms around herself as another gust of wind sent rain sideways into the shelter. "Where are you trying to get to?" the man asked. Maybe I can give you a ride. Every safety lesson Grace had ever learned told her to say no. Never get in a car with a stranger, especially not at night when no one would see you leave. But the rain was getting worse, her phone battery was dying, and the thought of walking 2 hours in this weather was making her feel desperate. I don't even know your name, she said, which was a polite way of saying, I'm not stupid enough to get in your car. Julian Sterling, he said, extending his hand like they were meeting at a business conference instead of a bus stop in a storm. And you are? Grace. She shook his hand, surprised by how warm his skin was compared to her frozen fingers. Sterling. Like Sterling Medical Corporation? Julian nodded, looking slightly embarrassed. That's me. CO and apparently the guy who stops to help nurses get home safely. Grace blinked in surprise. Sterling Medical Corporation owned half the hospitals in the state, including City General where she worked. Julian Sterling wasn't just rich, he was billionaire rich. The kind of man who probably had 5 houses and a private jet. You're really Julian Sterling? She asked. I can show you my driver's license if you want, Julian said with a smile. Though it might be hard to read in this rain. Despite everything telling her this was a bad idea, Grace found herself almost smiling back. There was something about Julian that didn't fit her mental image of a cold, calculating CEO. He seemed normal. Concerned about a stranger's welfare rather than acting like he was too important to notice other people's problems. I live in Riverside, Grace said. It's probably not anywhere near where you're going. Actually, it's exactly where I'm going, Julian said. I have a penthouse downtown, which means I'll drive right through Riverside to get there. Grace knew he was probably lying to make her feel better about accepting the ride, but she was too cold and tired to care. The rain was soaking through her shoes now, and she could feel herself starting to shiver uncontrollably. Okay, she said finally. Thank you. I really appreciate it. Julian's smile widened and he gestured toward his car. Great. Let's get you out of this weather. The inside of Julian's car was like stepping into another world. The seats were soft leather that felt warm against Grace's cold skin, and the heater was already running, filling the space with blessed warmth. Classical music played softly from speakers that probably cost more than Grace's entire car payment. Better? Julian asked as he slid into the driver's seat. Much, Grace said, settling back into the passenger seat and trying not to drip too much water on the expensive upholstery. I'm sorry about getting your car wet. Don't worry about it, Julian said, pulling away from the curb. Cars are meant to handle a little water. As they drove through the city streets, Grace found herself stealing glances at Julian. In the soft light from the dashboard, he looked even more handsome than he had under the streetlight. But more than that, he seemed genuinely nice. He asked about her work at the hospital, listened. When she talked about her long shift, and didn't make her feel like she was bothering him by accepting his help. You work at City General? Julian asked when Grace mentioned her job. Yeah, ICU nurse, Grace said. Crazy hours, but I love it. I know City General well, Julian said. Sterling Medical has been working with them on some new equipment installations. The staff there does amazing work. Grace felt a little thrill at the compliment, even though Julian probably said nice things about all the hospitals his company worked with. Still, it was nice to hear someone acknowledge how hard the nursing staff worked, especially someone who actually had the power to make their jobs easier. The new ventilators in the ICU are incredible, Grace said. They've made such a difference for our patients. I'm glad to hear that, Julian said, and he sounded like he really meant it. That's exactly why we do what we do. They talked easily for the rest of the drive, and Grace found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't expected. Julian was easy to talk to, funny without trying too hard, and he seemed genuinely interested in what she had to say. By the time they pulled up in front of her apartment building, Grace was almost disappointed the ride was over. This is perfect, she said, gesturing toward her building. Thank you so much for the ride. You probably saved me from pneumonia. It was my pleasure, Julian said, and something in his voice made Grace look at him more closely. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not predatory or creepy, but intense in a way that made her stomach flutter. Well, Grace said, suddenly feeling awkward. I should go inside and get out of these wet clothes. Grace, Julian said as she reached for the door handle. Would you maybe like to have dinner sometime? I know a great place downtown. Grace hesitated. Julian seemed nice and he was definitely attractive, but he was also a billionaire CEO and she was a nurse who couldn't afford taxi fare. They lived in completely different worlds. I don't know, she said honestly. Julian, you seem really great, but I'm not sure we have much in common. We both work in healthcare, Julian pointed out. We both care about helping people. And we both apparently have terrible luck with public transportation timing. Grace laughed despite herself. When you put it that way? Think about it, Julian said gently. No pressure. But Grace, I'd really like to see you again. Okay, Grace said, surprising herself. I'll think about it. Good, Julian said, his smile lighting up his whole face. Get inside before you catch pneumonia for real. Grace climbed out of the car and hurried toward her building, waving goodbye as Julian pulled away from the curb. As she rode the elevator up to her apartment, she found herself smiling. Maybe accepting rides from strangers wasn't always a terrible idea. 3 days later, she would remember this moment and wonder if she should have trusted her first instincts after all. Grace's teeth were chattering so hard she could barely speak by the time Julian's car pulled into the underground garage of a gleaming downtown high-rise. The building looked like something out of a movie, all glass and steel reaching up into the stormy night sky. This isn't Riverside, Grace said, suddenly feeling nervous again. No, it's my building, Julian said calmly, parking the car in a spot marked Reserved J. Sterling. Grace, you're soaked through and shivering. Let me get you somewhere warm and dry before I take you home. Grace wanted to argue, but another violent shiver made her realize Julian was right. Her scrubs were plastered to her skin, and she could feel water squelching in her shoes with every step. She was probably going to get hypothermia if she didn't get warm soon. I don't want to impose, she said weakly. You're not imposing, Julian said, getting out of the car and coming around to open her door. You're letting me be a decent human being. The elevator ride to Julian's penthouse was silent except for the soft sound of water dripping from Grace's clothes onto the polished floor. She caught her reflection in the mirrored wall and winced. Her hair was plastered to her head, her makeup was smeared down her cheeks, and she looked like she'd been swimming in her uniform. Next to Julian, who somehow still managed to look put together despite being caught in the same storm, she felt like a drowned rat. The elevator opened directly into Julian's apartment, and Grace's breath caught in her throat. The space was enormous, with floor-to-ceiling windows that showed the city sparkling below them despite the rain. The furniture looked like it belonged in a design magazine, all clean lines and expensive fabrics in shades of white and gray. Wow, Grace said softly. This is incredible. Thank you, Julian said, seeming pleased by her reaction. But right now let's focus on getting you warm. The bathroom is through that door. There are towels and a robe you can use. I'll find you some dry clothes. Grace wanted to protest that she didn't need clothes, that Julian should just call her a taxi so she could go home. But she was shivering too hard to form the words, and the thought of standing in wet scrubs for another hour was unbearable. The bathroom was bigger than Grace's bedroom, with a marble shower that could fit 4 people and a bathtub that looked like it belonged in a spa. Grace stripped out of her wet clothes and wrapped herself in the softest towel she'd ever felt. Her reflection in the mirror looked slightly less pathetic now that her hair wasn't dripping, but she still felt completely out of place in this luxury penthouse. A soft knock on the door made her jump. Grace? I left some clothes outside the door for you, Julian called. Take your time. Grace cracked the door and found a neat pile of clothing waiting for her. Soft gray sweatpants that were obviously expensive despite being casual, a white t-shirt that felt like silk, and even a pair of warm socks. Everything was too big for her, but it was dry and warm and smelled faintly like Julian's cologne. When she emerged from the bathroom, Julian was in the kitchen area, stirring something on the stove. He'd changed out of his wet suit into dark jeans and a navy sweater that made his eyes look even greener. Somehow he looked just as good in casual clothes as he had in his business attire. Feeling better? He asked, looking up from whatever he was cooking. Much, thank you, Grace said, suddenly feeling shy. The clothes he'd given her were so big they made her look like a child playing dress-up, but they were wonderfully warm. You didn't have to do all this. I wanted to, Julian said simply. I made hot soup, nothing fancy, just from a can, but it'll help warm you up from the inside. Grace approached the kitchen island, still feeling like she was in a dream. 6 hours ago, she'd been dealing with difficult patients and understaffed shifts. Now she was wearing a billionaire's clothes in his penthouse apartment. Watching him make her soup like this was a perfectly normal Tuesday night. Julian, she said carefully, why are you being so nice to me? I mean, you don't know me at all. Julian paused in his stirring and looked at her seriously. Do I need a reason to help someone who needed help? Most people would have just driven past, Grace pointed out. Most people aren't me, Julian said with a small smile. Grace, I spend most of my time in boardrooms with people who only care about profit margins and stock prices. Meeting someone who dedicates her life to helping others, it's refreshing. Grace felt heat rise in her cheeks at the compliment. I'm not anyone special. I'm just doing my job. You worked a 16-hour shift today, Julian said, ladling soup into a bowl. You were standing in the rain at midnight because you missed your bus, probably because you stayed late to help a patient or cover for a coworker. That's not just doing your job, that's being someone special. Grace stared at him, surprised by how much he'd picked up from their brief conversation in the car. Most people heard nurse, and assumed she was just following orders, not making real decisions or sacrifices. How did you know I stayed late? She asked. Because the shift schedule at City General ends at 11, Julian said, handing her the bowl of soup. And because you have the look of someone who puts other people's needs before her own. The soup was perfect, hot and comforting, and exactly what Grace needed. She settled onto one of Julian's expensive-looking bar stools and let the warmth spread through her body. This is really good, she said. Thank you. You're welcome, Julian said, sitting across from her with his own bowl. So tell me about your day. What made you stay late? Grace found herself talking about her patients, about Mrs. Rodriguez who was recovering from surgery and needed someone to sit with her when she got scared, about the new resident who was overwhelmed and needed guidance, about the understaffing that meant everyone had to work harder just to keep up. Julian listened like he was genuinely interested, asking questions that showed he understood the healthcare world better than most people outside of it. You love your job, Julian observed. I do, Grace said, surprised by how easy it was to talk to him. It's hard and the hours are terrible and the pay isn't great, but I can't imagine doing anything else. That's rare, Julian said. Most people I know, myself included, work because they have to. Finding something you're passionate about is a gift. What about you? Grace asked. Do you like running a medical corporation? Julian was quiet for a moment, staring into his soup. I like the parts where we can actually help people, he said finally. Developing new equipment, funding research, supporting hospitals like City General. But there's a lot of politics and business strategy that gets in the way of the actual helping. Grace studied his face, seeing something almost sad in his expression. It must be lonely, she said softly, being responsible for so much. Julian looked up at her, surprise flickering across his features. Most people think being a CEO means having all the power and freedom in the world. But it really means everyone wants something from you, and you can't trust if people like you or for what you can do for them, Grace said. The silence that followed her words was heavy with recognition. Julian stared at her like she just solved a puzzle he'd been working on for years. Exactly, he said quietly. They finished their soup in comfortable silence, and Grace found herself relaxing completely for the first time all day. Julian's apartment was warm and peaceful, and he was surprisingly easy company. When he offered her more soup, she accepted, and when he suggested they sit on his couch instead of at the kitchen counter, she followed him without hesitation. The couch was enormous and incredibly comfortable, facing the wall of windows that showed the city lights twinkling below. The rain was still coming down, making the windows look like watercolor paintings. I should probably get home soon, Grace said, though she made no move to get up. Of course, Julian said. But Grace, the rain is supposed to get worse before it gets better. Why don't you wait until it calms down a bit? Grace knew she should insist on leaving, should get back to her real life and stop playing pretend in this fairy tale apartment. But the couch was so comfortable and the warmth was making her sleepy after her long day, and Julian was... Grace. Julian's voice seemed to come from far away. Grace opened her eyes and realized she'd fallen asleep on Julian's couch. The storm was still raging outside, but she felt warm and safe wrapped in the soft throw blanket Julian must have put over her. I'm sorry, she said, sitting up quickly. I didn't mean to fall asleep. Don't apologize, Julian said gently. You were exhausted. Grace, it's almost 3 in the morning and the storm is getting worse. Why don't you stay here tonight? I have a guest room and you'll be safe and comfortable. Grace's first instinct was to refuse, to insist on going home despite the weather. But something in Julian's voice, the genuine concern in his eyes, made her hesitate. I don't want to be any trouble, she said. You're not trouble, Julian said firmly. Grace, you've worked 16 hours straight and you're exhausted. Let me take care of you for one night. The way he said it, so gentle and sincere, made Grace's heart flutter in a way that had nothing to do with the storm outside. Maybe staying one night wouldn't hurt. Maybe Julian Sterling was exactly as kind as he seemed. Okay, she said softly. Thank you. As Julian showed her to the guest room, Grace told herself this was just practical. Just 2 people being smart about dangerous weather. But deep down she knew it was more than that. Something was happening between them, something that felt bigger than a chance meeting at a bus stop. She just had no idea how much her life was about to change. Grace woke up to sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows and the smell of coffee drifting from somewhere nearby. For a moment she couldn't remember where she was. The bed was too comfortable, the sheets too soft, the room too bright and airy to be her cramped apartment. Then the memories came flooding back. The storm, Julian Sterling, his penthouse apartment, falling asleep on his couch. Grace sat up quickly, checking the clock on the nightstand. 9:23 a.m. She was supposed to be at work in 37 minutes for her morning shift. No, 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 Grace muttered, jumping out of bed and looking around for her clothes. But instead of her damp scrubs from last night, she found a neat pile of fresh clothing on the chair by the window. Dark jeans that looked exactly her size, a soft blue sweater, and even undergarments that were somehow the right size and still had tags on them. Grace stared at the clothes, a cold feeling settling in her stomach. When had Julian gone shopping? How did he know her sizes? And more importantly, why did he think he could just buy her things without asking? A soft knock on the door interrupted her spiraling thoughts. Grace? Are you awake? Julian's voice called from the hallway. I'm up, Grace called back, quickly putting on the new clothes. They fit perfectly, which somehow made her more uncomfortable instead of less. When she opened the door, Julian was standing there with a cup of coffee and a warm smile. He was already dressed for work in a charcoal gray suit, looking like he'd stepped out of a business magazine. Good morning, he said, offering her the coffee. Sleep well. Julian, I'm late for work, Grace said, accepting the coffee but feeling increasingly panicked. I need to get home and change in. Already taken care of, Julian said calmly. I called City General this morning and explained that you had a family emergency and wouldn't be in for the rest of the week. Grace felt like the floor had dropped out from under her. You did what? I spoke to your supervisor, Nancy, I think? Very understanding woman. She said to tell you not to worry about anything and to take care of your family. Julian, you can't just call my job. Grace's voice was getting higher, panic and anger mixing in her chest. You don't have the right to make decisions about my life. Julian's smile faded, replaced by an expression Grace couldn't quite read. Grace, calm down. I was trying to help. Help? Grace set down the coffee cup with shaking hands. Julian, I need that job. I can't just take a week off because you decided I should. You won't lose any pay, Julian said quietly. I made sure of that. The cold feeling in Grace's stomach was spreading. How exactly did you make sure of that? Julian was quiet for a moment, and Grace could see him choosing his words carefully. Sterling Medical Corporation made a donation to City General's Nursing Education Fund. Enough to cover your salary and benefits for the week. Grace stared at him, trying to process what he was telling her. You paid my job to give me time off? I paid them to take care of one of their best nurses, Julian corrected. Grace, you were exhausted last night. You need rest. That's not your decision to make. Grace snapped. Julian, we barely know each other. You can't just take over my life. I'm not taking over your life, Julian said, but there was something in his voice that made Grace take a step back. I'm trying to protect you. Protect me from what? Working? Paying my bills? Having a normal life. Julian moved closer, and Grace noticed that he seemed to be blocking the doorway. Not obviously, but enough that she'd have to ask him to move if she wanted to leave the room. Grace, there are things you don't understand, Julian said carefully. Things that happened after you got in my car last night. What kind of things? Grace's heart was starting to race, and not in a good way. Julian pulled out his phone and showed her a photo. It was grainy and clearly taken from a security camera, but Grace could see her apartment building in the background and a familiar figure standing across the street. Tommy, Grace breathed, recognizing her ex-boyfriend despite the poor image quality. He was there this morning, Julian said. My security team spotted him around 6 a.m. Grace, he's been watching your building. Grace felt sick. She'd broken up with Tommy 6 months ago when his jealousy and possessiveness became too much to handle. The restraining order was supposed to keep him away, but clearly he wasn't respecting it. That doesn't explain why you think you can control my schedule, Grace said, trying to keep her voice steady. Because the moment you got in my car last night, you became connected to me, Julian said. And that makes you a target. A target for what? Julian was quiet for a long moment, and Grace could see him struggling with how much to tell her. Grace, I'm not just a CEO. I'm a very wealthy man with a lot of enemies. People who might want to hurt someone I care about. The words, "someone I care about," hung in the air between them. Grace felt a flutter of something that might have been warmth under different circumstances, but right now it just made her more afraid. "Julian, we met 12 hours ago," she said carefully. "You don't care about me. You don't even know me." Something flashed across Julian's face, hurt, maybe, or anger. "Don't I?" He moved to the side table and picked up a folder Grace hadn't noticed before. When he opened it, she could see papers inside, lots of them. Grace Marie Johnson, Julian read. 26 years old, graduated from State University's nursing program 3 years ago. You live in a one-bedroom apartment in Riverside with your roommate Sarah. You drive a 2018 Honda Civic that needs new brakes. You send money to your mother in Ohio every month even though you can barely afford your own rent. Grace felt the blood drain from her face. "How do you know all that?" "You work extra shifts whenever possible to pay off your student loans," Julian continued, not answering her question. "You volunteer at the free clinic on weekends. Last month you paid for an elderly patient's prescription out of your own pocket because she couldn't afford it." "Stop," Grace whispered. "You break up with boyfriends when they start getting serious because you don't trust people who say they love you," Julian said, his voice getting softer. "You think you're not worth fighting for." "Stop," Grace said louder, grabbing the folder from his hands. The papers inside were copies of background check reports, financial records, even photos of her at work and around the city. "Julian, what is this?" "It's me making sure you're safe," Julian said calmly. "Grace, the moment I decided I cared about you, I had to know everything about potential threats to your safety." Grace flipped through the papers with growing horror. There were reports on her co-workers, her friends, her family. Photos of her apartment building, her usual bus route, the grocery store where she shopped. Someone had been watching her, documenting her entire life. "This is insane," Grace said, her voice shaking. "Julian, this is stalking." "This is protection," Julian corrected. "Grace, you have no idea how dangerous my world can be. I couldn't let you walk into it unprepared. I never asked to walk into your world." Grace threw the folder down, papers scattering across the floor. "I just needed a ride home." Julian's jaw tightened. "It's too late for that now." The word sent a chill down Grace's spine. "What do you mean?" "I mean you're connected to me now whether we planned it or not," Julian said. "Grace, my enemies know about you. They know you spent the night here. They know I care about you." "Then I'll just leave," Grace said, moving toward the door. "I'll go home and pretend none of this ever happened." Julian didn't move out of her way. "Grace, I can't let you do that." "Can't let me?" Grace's voice was getting higher again. "Julian, you can't stop me from leaving." "Actually," Julian said quietly, "I can." Grace stared at him, seeing a completely different person than the kind, concerned man who had rescued her from the storm. This Julian looked cold, determined, and completely serious about keeping her here against her will. "You're scaring me," Grace said honestly. Pain flashed across Julian's face, but he didn't step aside. "I'm sorry. I never wanted to scare you. But Grace, I can't let you get hurt because of me. So you're going to keep me prisoner instead?" "I'm going to keep you safe," Julian said firmly. "Until I can eliminate the threats against you." Grace felt trapped, cornered by a man she'd thought was her rescuer but who was starting to look more like her captor. The beautiful penthouse suddenly felt like a cage, and Julian's concern was starting to look a lot like obsession. "How long?" she asked quietly. "However long it takes," Julian said. Grace closed her eyes, trying to think of a way out of this situation. When she opened them again, Julian was watching her with an expression that was part apology, part determination, and part something else that made her stomach flutter despite her fear. "I need some air," she said. "I need to think." "Of course," Julian said, finally stepping aside. "But Grace, please don't try to leave. I have security throughout the building, and they have orders to keep you safe." The unspoken addition even from yourself hung in the air as Grace walked past him toward the living room. As she stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows looking down at the city below, she wondered if she was looking at her future home or her very luxurious prison. Either way, she was beginning to understand that Julian Sterling was much more dangerous than she'd realized. And she was completely at his mercy. Grace spent the rest of the morning testing the boundaries of her golden cage. The penthouse was enormous: 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a gourmet kitchen, a home office, and a living area that could comfortably seat 20 people. Every surface was expensive, every view was spectacular, and every door that led to the outside world was locked. She tried the front door first, finding it secured with an electronic lock that required either a key card or a code she didn't have. The balcony door was the same, beautiful to look through, impossible to open. Even the windows were sealed, probably for safety reasons 40 floors up, but the effect was that Grace felt like a bird in the world's most luxurious cage. Julian had left for work around 10, kissing her forehead like they were an actual couple before heading to what he called meetings that couldn't be postponed. Grace had stood perfectly still during the kiss, torn between the flutter of attraction she felt and the growing certainty that she was in serious trouble. Now it was almost noon and Grace was pacing the living room like a caged animal. She tried calling her roommate Sarah, but her phone had no signal. When she'd asked Julian about it before he left, he'd explained apologetically that the building had signal-blocking technology for security reasons. She could use his landline for emergencies, but all calls were monitored. The landline sat on Julian's desk like a lifeline, but Grace knew that calling for help would only make things worse. What would she tell the police? That a billionaire was keeping her in his penthouse, feeding her gourmet food and buying her expensive clothes? That he'd rescued her from a storm and was now protecting her from threats she wasn't even sure were real? A soft ding from the elevator made Grace spin around. Julian stood in the doorway, holding a shopping bag and wearing the same warm smile he'd had when he'd first offered her a ride. "How was your morning?" he asked, setting the bag on the kitchen counter. "Terrible," Grace said honestly. "Julian, we need to talk." "Of course," Julian said, loosening his tie. "But first I brought you lunch. Thai food from that place on 5th Street. I remembered you mentioning you liked Thai food." Grace stared at him. During their conversation in the car last night, she'd made one casual comment about loving Thai food when they'd passed a restaurant. Julian had filed that information away and acted on it 12 hours later. "When did I mention Thai food?" she asked. "Last night when we drove past Bangkok Garden," Julian said, unpacking containers that smelled incredible. "You said you went there sometimes after long shifts." The fact that he remembered such a small detail should have been sweet. Instead, it felt like more evidence that Julian paid attention to everything she said and did, cataloging information for reasons she didn't understand. "Julian, I want to go home," Grace said, not moving toward the food despite her empty stomach. "I know," Julian said gently. "And I wish I could let you. But Grace, things have gotten more complicated since this morning." Grace felt her heart sink. "What do you mean?" Julian pulled out his phone and showed her another security photo. This one showed Tommy standing outside City General Hospital, apparently arguing with someone in security uniform. "He went to your work looking for you," Julian said. "When they told him you were dealing with a family emergency, he became aggressive. Hospital security had to escort him off the property." Grace sank onto one of the bar stools, feeling overwhelmed. Tommy had always been jealous and possessive, but showing up at her work was a new level of invasive behavior. "That still doesn't give you the right to keep me here," she said weakly. "Grace, there's more." Julian's voice was gentle but firm. "My security team did some digging into Tommy's background. He's been arrested twice in the past year for stalking other women. The charges were dropped both times, but the pattern is clear." Grace felt sick. She'd known Tommy was controlling and jealous, but she'd never thought he was dangerous. The fact that there were other women, that this was a pattern for him, made her realize how lucky she'd been to get away when she did. "And there's this," Julian said, showing her another photo. This one showed a different man, someone Grace didn't recognize, standing across the street from Julian's building. "Who is that?" Grace asked. "Someone who works for people who don't like me very much," Julian said carefully. "Grace, I told you that you became a target when you got involved with me. I wasn't exaggerating." Grace studied the photo, trying to read the expression on the stranger's face. He looked ordinary, like someone she might pass on the street without noticing. But something about the way he was standing, watching the building, made her skin crawl. "What does he want?" she asked. "Information about me," Julian said. "About my business, my personal life, my weaknesses. And Grace, you're my weakness now." The words hit Grace like a physical blow. "I never asked to be your weakness." "I know," Julian said, his voice full of regret. "If I could go back and change things, if I could have driven past that bus stop and left you safe in your normal life, maybe I would." "Maybe?" Grace looked up at him, surprised by his honesty. Julian met her eyes directly. "Probably not." "Grace, I know this is crazy and I know it's not fair to you, but I've never met anyone like you. The way you care about people, the way you put others first even when it costs you. I've been looking for someone like you my whole life." Grace felt her resolve wavering despite everything. There was something in Julian's voice, a loneliness that matched her own, that made her want to comfort him even when he was the one keeping her prisoner. "That doesn't make this right," she said. No, it doesn't, Julian agreed. But Grace, right and wrong don't matter if you're dead. The blunt words made Grace flinch. You really think I'm in danger? I know you are, Julian said. From Tommy, from my enemies, from people who would use you to get to me without caring if you got hurt in the process. Grace looked around the penthouse, trying to imagine this luxurious space as a safe house instead of a prison. It was easier than she wanted to admit. How long? She asked quietly. I don't know, Julian said honestly. I have people working on the Tommy situation, and I'm taking steps to neutralize the other threats. But Grace, these things take time. Days? Weeks? Months? Grace pressed. Julian was quiet for a long moment. Probably weeks. Grace closed her eyes, trying to process the idea of being trapped here for weeks with a man she barely knew. A man who claimed to care about her but who was keeping her against her will. I need some rules, she said finally. Julian looked surprised. Rules? If I'm going to be stuck here, I need to know what I can and can't do, Grace said. I need to understand the boundaries of this arrangement. Julian nodded slowly. That's fair. What do you want to know? Can I contact my family? My friends? Can I call in sick to work myself instead of having you do it? You can call your family, but the calls will be monitored for security reasons, Julian said. Your friends? That's more complicated. The fewer people who know where you are, the safer you'll be. What about work? I've taken care of your work situation, Julian said. Grace, you don't need to worry about money or bills or any of that while you're here. Because you're paying for everything? Because I'm taking care of you, Julian corrected. Grace felt a flash of anger. I can take care of myself. Not from threats like these, Julian said firmly. Grace, I understand this is hard for you. I understand you're used to being independent. But sometimes accepting help isn't weakness, it's survival. Grace wanted to argue, wanted to insist that she could handle Tommy and mysterious strangers and whatever other dangers Julian thought were lurking. But the truth was she was scared. The photos Julian had shown her, the idea that multiple people might want to hurt her, made her feel vulnerable in a way she'd never experienced before. I want to see more evidence, she said. I want to understand exactly what threats we're talking about. Are you sure? Julian asked. Grace, some of this information is disturbing. I'm sure, Grace said. If I'm going to be a prisoner here, I deserve to know why. Julian winced at the word, prisoner, but he nodded. Okay, but let's eat first. You need food, and this conversation is going to be difficult. As Julian set out the Thai food, Grace realized she was at a crossroads. She could keep fighting Julian's protection, keep insisting on her independence even if it put her in danger. Or she could try to understand his world, learn about the threats he claimed were real, and figure out if there was a way to be safe without being a prisoner. Looking at Julian as he carefully prepared her plate, Grace saw something she'd missed before. He wasn't just protective, he was terrified. Terrified of losing someone he cared about, terrified of making the wrong choice, terrified of being responsible if something happened to her. Maybe Julian Sterling wasn't the villain in this story after all. Maybe he was just a man trying to protect someone he was falling in love with, even if his methods were extreme. The question was Grace falling in love with him too? After lunch, Julian led Grace to his home office, a room she hadn't explored yet. Unlike the rest of the penthouse with its clean, modern aesthetic, the office felt more personal. There were family photos on the desk, awards on the walls, and bookshelves filled with medical journals and business texts. Sit, Julian said gently, gesturing to a leather chair across from his desk. Grace, what I'm about to show you is going to be hard to hear. Grace settled into the chair, trying to prepare herself for whatever Julian was about to reveal. He pulled out a thick folder from his desk drawer different from the one that had contained information about her life. 3 years ago, my younger sister Emma was kidnapped, Julian said quietly, opening the folder to reveal police reports and newspaper clippings. Grace felt her breath catch. Julian, I'm so sorry. She was 24, just graduated from medical school, Julian continued, his voice carefully controlled. Emma was volunteering at a free clinic in the city when someone grabbed her in the parking lot. They held her for 6 days before. Julian's voice trailed off, and Grace could see the pain etched in his face. Before what? Grace asked softly. Before my father paid the ransom, Julian said. $5 million. But they didn't release Emma right away. They kept her for another week just to prove they could. Julian pulled out a photo and handed it to Grace. It showed a young woman with Julian's green eyes and dark hair, smiling brightly in what looked like a graduation photo. She was beautiful, but more than that, she looked kind and intelligent. She looks like someone who would volunteer at free clinics, Grace said. She was a lot like you, Julian said. Always putting other people first, always trying to help. After they released her, Emma was never the same. She had panic attacks, couldn't sleep, couldn't be alone. She moved back home and barely left the house. Grace felt tears prick her eyes. Julian, I can't imagine how terrifying that must have been for all of you. It was, Julian said. But Grace, the worst part was that we never found out who did it. The people who took Emma covered their tracks perfectly. We knew it was connected to Sterling Medical Corporation. The ransom demand mentioned our predatory business practices and our exploitation of healthcare workers. Your business has enemies? Julian laughed, but there was no humor in it. Grace, when you run a company worth billions, you make enemies just by existing. People who think you have too much money, competitors who want to destroy you, activists who blame you for everything wrong with healthcare. Most of them are harmless, but some. Julian pulled out another set of photos. These showed threatening letters, spray-painted messages on Sterling medical buildings, and police reports from incidents Grace couldn't even have imagined. This is from last year, Julian said, showing her a photo of his car with all 4 tires slashed and the word murderer scratched into the paint. This was 2 months ago. Another photo showed the windows of a Sterling medical office building broken, glass scattered across the sidewalk. Grace studied the images, trying to process the level of hatred they represented. But why Emma? Why not target you directly? Because hurting family members sends a stronger message, Julian said grimly. Emma was an easy target, young, trusting, predictable in her routines. Just like me, Grace finished. Julian nodded. Grace, the moment you got in my car, you became a potential target. These people don't care that you're innocent, that you have nothing to do with my business decisions. All they care about is that hurting you would hurt me. Grace felt a chill run down her spine. But how would they even know about me? Julian pulled out his phone and showed her a series of photos that made her stomach drop. They were surveillance shots of her and Julian from the night before getting into his car at the bus stop, arriving at his building, even one that seemed to be taken from inside the parking garage. Someone was watching us, Grace said, her voice barely a whisper. Someone is always watching me, Julian said. Grace, I have security teams, bodyguards, threat assessment specialists, all because people want to hurt me through the people I care about. Is Emma okay now? Grace asked. Julian's expression darkened. Emma died 8 months ago. Grace felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. What? Officially it was suicide, Julian said, his voice flat and emotionless. She took an overdose of sleeping pills. But Grace, my sister, was getting better. She was starting to go out again, talking about going back to medicine. She was planning to move into her own apartment. You don't think it was suicide, Grace said. I think someone made her death look like suicide, Julian said. I think the people who kidnapped her decided she was still a liability, or they wanted to send me another message. Grace stared at the photo of Emma, this young woman who looked so much like someone Grace could have been friends with. The idea that someone had taken her life just to hurt Julian was almost too horrible to comprehend. Julian, I'm so sorry, Grace said, tears sliding down her cheeks. I couldn't protect her, Julian said, and Grace could hear the guilt and pain in his voice. I had security on her, I had her staying in a safe house, I thought I was doing everything right. But it wasn't enough. Grace understood now why Julian was being so extreme about her safety. In his mind, she was Emma, another innocent person whose life was in danger because of their connection to him. That's why you can't let me leave, Grace said. That's why I won't lose someone else, Julian corrected. Grace, I know this seems crazy and controlling and wrong. But I would rather have you hate me and be alive than lose you the way I lost Emma. Grace looked around the office, seeing it differently now. The awards and photos weren't displays of success, they were reminders of what Julian was trying to protect. The security measures weren't about control, they were about preventing another tragedy. Show me the rest, Grace said quietly. Julian looked surprised. Grace, you don't need to see. Show me everything, Grace insisted. If I'm going to understand this situation, I need to know what we're really dealing with. For the next hour, Julian walked Grace through files that read like something out of a crime thriller. Threatening letters that were increasingly specific and personal. Photos of Julian taken with long-range cameras from impossible angles. Evidence of people following his employees, his friends, anyone connected to Sterling Medical Corporation. The most disturbing file contained information about other wealthy families who had been targeted in similar ways. Business leaders who had lost family members to accidents or suicides that were suspiciously timed. A pattern of intimidation and violence that made Grace realize Julian's fears weren't paranoia, they were based on very real precedents. "This is insane," Grace said, closing the last file. "Julian, how do you live like this?" "Very carefully," Julian said. "And very alone until now." Grace looked at him, seeing the weight he carried in his shoulders, the exhaustion in his eyes that had nothing to do with lack of sleep. Julian Sterling wasn't just a billionaire CEO, he was a man under siege, trying to protect what little he had left to care about. "The man watching your building this morning," Grace said. "Do you know who he works for?" "We're still investigating," Julian said. "But Grace, it doesn't matter who specifically is threatening you. What matters is that the threat is real." Grace nodded, finally understanding the scope of what Julian was dealing with. Her anger at being kept here was starting to transform into something else, not acceptance, exactly, but a reluctant recognition that Julian might be right about the danger. "What about Tommy?" she asked. "Tommy is actually the least of our problems," Julian said. "He's a garden variety stalker and my security team can handle him. It's the professional threats we need to worry about." Grace thought about her normal life, going to work, taking the bus, grabbing groceries at the corner store. All activities that Julian apparently couldn't do without extensive security planning. "This is why you don't have close relationships," Grace said, understanding dawning. "This is why you're always alone." "It's safer for everyone that way," Julian agreed. "Grace, I never meant for you to get pulled into this world. If I could take it back." "But you can't," Grace finished. "And neither can I." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the situation settling between them. Grace was beginning to understand that there might not be an easy way out of this, that Julian's protection might be the only thing standing between her and very real danger. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now we wait," Julian said. "My team is working to identify and neutralize the threats. We're handling the Tommy situation. And in the meantime you stay safe." "For how long?" Julian met her eyes directly. "However long it takes." Grace nodded slowly, realizing that she was going to have to find a way to make peace with this situation. Julian wasn't just being controlling, he was trying to keep her alive. And as much as she hated feeling trapped, she was starting to understand that the alternative might be much worse. "Julian," she said softly. "Yeah. I need you to promise me something. Anything. Promise me that when this is over, when the threats are gone, you'll let me choose," Grace said. "Choose whether to stay in your world or go back to mine." Julian was quiet for a long moment, and Grace could see him struggling with her request. "I promise," he said finally. "Grace, I promise that when you're safe, the choice will be yours." Grace hoped he meant it. Because despite everything, the danger, the luxury prison, the overwhelming nature of Julian's world, she was starting to care about him too. And that scared her almost as much as the threats outside. Over the next 3 days, Grace began to see a different side of Julian Sterling. It started with small things. The way he made sure she had coffee exactly how she liked it every morning, even though she'd only mentioned her preference once. How he moved his work schedule around so they could eat meals together, treating her like a partner rather than a burden. The careful way he asked for her opinion on everything from what to watch on TV to which restaurants to order from, making it clear that her comfort mattered to him. But it was the bigger things that really changed how Grace saw him. On her 4th morning in the penthouse, Grace woke up to find Julian on a video call in his office. The door was slightly open, and she could hear him talking to someone about hospital equipment shortages. "I don't care what the profit margins look like," Julian was saying firmly. "City General needs those ventilators now, not when it becomes financially convenient for us. People are dying while we worry about quarterly reports." Grace paused in the hallway, listening as Julian argued with what sounded like his entire board of directors about prioritizing patient care over profits. This wasn't the cold, calculating businessman she'd imagined when she'd first learned who he was. This was someone who genuinely cared about the impact his company had on people's lives. Later that morning, Julian found her reading on the couch. "How much of that conversation did you hear?" he asked, settling beside her with his own coffee. "Enough to know you're not what I expected," Grace said honestly. "What did you expect?" Grace considered the question. Someone who cared more about money than people. Someone who wouldn't understand what it's like to worry about paying bills or working extra shifts just to make ends meet. Julian was quiet for a moment. "Grace, can I tell you something about my family?" Grace nodded, curious about this glimpse into Julian's past. "My parents started Sterling Medical Corporation in their garage," Julian said. "My dad was a paramedic, my mom was a nurse. They invented a better heart monitor because they were frustrated with the equipment they had to work with. Grace looked at Julian with new interest. Your parents were medical professionals? My dad died responding to a car accident when I was 16, Julian continued. My mom kept the company going, but she never forgot where we came from. She used to say that every piece of equipment we made had to be something she'd want treating her own family. She sounds amazing, Grace said softly. She was, Julian agreed. She died of cancer 5 years ago, but not before making me promise to remember that our real job wasn't making money, it was saving lives. Grace studied Julian's face, seeing the love and loss there. Is that why you argue with your board about profit margins? Partly, Julian said. But also because I've seen what happens when people like you don't have the equipment they need to do their jobs. Grace, I've visited hospitals where nurses are rationing supplies because they can't afford to restock. I've seen doctors making impossible choices because they don't have enough ventilators or monitors or basic surgical tools. Grace felt something shift in her chest, a warming toward Julian that had nothing to do with attraction and everything to do with respect. That's why you know so much about how hospitals work. I spent summers as a teenager volunteering in emergency rooms, Julian said. My mom insisted on it. She said I couldn't run a medical company if I didn't understand what it was like to actually work in medicine. Grace tried to imagine teenage Julian mopping floors and delivering supplies in busy hospitals, learning to see the healthcare world from the ground up instead of from a corporate boardroom. Emma wanted to be a doctor, Julian continued. She said she wanted to work in free clinics her whole life, helping people who couldn't afford regular healthcare. After she was kidnapped, I started funding free clinics in her honor. How many? Grace asked. 17 so far, Julian said. We provide equipment, supplies, even salary support for staff. It's not charity, it's what Emma would have wanted. Grace felt tears prick her eyes. Julian wasn't just protecting her out of some misguided sense of ownership. He was protecting her because he'd lost someone who reminded him of her, someone who had dedicated her life to helping others the same way Grace did. I'm sorry I called you controlling, Grace said softly. You weren't wrong, Julian said with a rueful smile. Grace, I know I'm being extreme about your safety. I know this situation is unfair to you. But I can't. I won't lose someone else the way I lost Emma. Grace reached over and took Julian's hand, surprised by how natural the gesture felt. His fingers were warm and strong, and when he squeezed back, she felt a connection that went deeper than physical attraction. Tell me about her, Grace said. Tell me about Emma. For the next hour, Julian shared stories about his sister. Emma, who had been afraid of spiders but performed surgery without flinching. Emma, who had baked terrible cookies but made them for every hospital staff birthday anyway. Emma, who had been planning to spend her career working with underserved populations because she believed healthcare was a right, not a privilege. The more Julian talked, the more Grace understood his fear. Emma sounded like someone Grace would have been friends with, someone who shared her values and dedication to helping others. The idea that Emma had been targeted specifically because of those qualities, because someone had wanted to hurt Julian through his sister, made Grace feel sick. She would have liked you, Julian said finally. I would have liked her too, Grace said, meaning it. They spent the rest of the day talking about their families, their work, their hopes for the future. Grace learned that Julian had turned down multiple offers to sell Sterling Medical Corporation because he believed healthcare companies should be led by people who understood medicine, not just business. Julian learned that Grace had chosen nursing over medical school not because she couldn't handle the academics, but because she preferred direct patient care to the administrative side of medicine. As evening approached, Grace found herself looking forward to dinner with Julian instead of feeling trapped by his presence. When he suggested they cook together instead of ordering in, she agreed without hesitation. I should warn you, Julian said as they stood in his gourmet kitchen, I'm better at ordering takeout than actually cooking. Lucky for you, I lived on ramen and whatever I could make in a tiny kitchen for 3 years, Grace said, laughing. I'm pretty resourceful. They worked together to make pasta with a simple tomato sauce, and Grace was surprised by how domestic and comfortable it felt. Julian was funny and self-deprecating about his cooking skills, and he listened intently when Grace told him stories about her nursing school days. You know, Grace said as they sat down to eat, this is the most normal I've felt since I got here. Normal is good, Julian said. Grace, I want you to feel comfortable here. I want this to feel like home, not like a prison. Grace considered his words. It's starting to feel less like a prison, she admitted. But Julian, it still isn't home. Home is something you choose, not something you're forced into. Julian nodded, looking thoughtful. When this is over, when you're safe, I want you to choose to stay. Not because you have to, but because you want to. What if I choose to leave? Grace asked quietly. Julian was quiet for a long moment. Then I'll respect that choice, he said finally. Grace, I care about you too much to keep you somewhere you don't want to be. Grace believed him, which surprised her. 3 days ago, she would have thought Julian was lying, telling her what she wanted to hear to keep her compliant. But now, having seen his genuine care for others, having heard about his family and his values, she thought he might actually mean it. Julian, she said softly. Yeah. Thank you for telling me about Emma. For helping me understand. Thank you for listening, Julian said. And Grace? Thank you for giving me a chance to explain instead of just hating me. Grace smiled, feeling something warm and hopeful blooming in her chest. I don't hate you, Julian. I'm starting to think I might be falling for you instead. The words hung in the air between them, honest and vulnerable and terrifying. Julian's face lit up with a smile that transformed his entire expression. I was hoping you might say that, he said softly. Because Grace, I've been falling for you since the moment you got in my car. As they finished dinner, Grace realized that something fundamental had shifted between them. She was still technically a prisoner in Julian's penthouse, still surrounded by threats she didn't fully understand. But for the first time she was beginning to think that maybe when this was all over she might choose to stay. Not because she had to, but because she was falling in love with Julian Sterling despite all the reasons she shouldn't be. Grace woke up to the sound of shouting. It was barely dawn, gray light filtering through the penthouse windows, and Julian's side of the bed was empty. Over the past week, they'd fallen into the habit of sleeping in the same bed, not making love, but holding each other through the night like they were anchoring each other to safety. But now Julian was gone, and angry voices were coming from somewhere in the penthouse. Grace slipped out of bed and pulled on Julian's robe, following the sound of the argument. She found Julian in his office, talking rapidly into his phone while pacing back and forth. His hair was disheveled like he'd been running his hands through it, and his expression was darker than Grace had ever seen it. I don't care what it costs, Julian was saying. Find him. Find him now before he does something we can't undo. Grace paused in the doorway, suddenly afraid to interrupt. Julian looked dangerous in a way she'd never seen before, all sharp edges and barely controlled fury. What do you mean he's not at his apartment? Julian continued. Where else would he? What? When? Julian's face went completely white and Grace felt her stomach drop. How long ago? Julian asked, his voice deadly quiet. Why wasn't I informed immediately? Grace stepped into the office and Julian turned to look at her. The expression on his face made her take an involuntary step backward. I'll call you back, Julian said into the phone, hanging up without taking his eyes off Grace. What's wrong? Grace asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Tommy escaped police custody 3 hours ago, Julian said flatly. Grace felt the blood drain from her face. What do you mean escaped? I mean he was being transported to a holding facility after violating his restraining order again, and he attacked the transport officers and ran, Julian said. Grace, he's out there and he's angry and he knows you're connected to me now. Grace sank into the chair across from Julian's desk, trying to process what he was telling her. How does he know about you? Julian ran his hands through his hair, looking older than his 30-something years. Because my security team has been monitoring him and he figured it out. Grace, Tommy has been planning this. He's been watching my building, studying my security protocols, learning everything he can about how to get to you. But I'm safe here, Grace said, though her voice sounded uncertain even to herself. Are you? Julian pulled out his phone and showed her a series of text messages that made her blood turn cold. I know where you are, Grace. That rich boy can't protect you forever. You belong with me, not him. I'm coming for you. The messages were time-stamped within the last hour. He's been sending these to your work phone, Julian explained. The one you left at the hospital. Grace, he's escalating. Grace stared at the messages, seeing a side of Tommy she'd never experienced directly but had always feared was there. The threats were specific and personal, written by someone who wasn't just angry but completely unhinged. What do we do? She asked. We wait, Julian said grimly. My security team is coordinating with police to find him. But Grace, until he's caught, you can't leave this building. Not for any reason. Grace nodded, understanding that this wasn't Julian being controlling anymore. This was a real and immediate threat to her safety. The next few hours passed in tense silence. Julian made phone call after phone call, coordinating with his security team and demanding updates from police. Grace tried to read, tried to watch TV, tried to do anything that would distract her from the growing sense of dread in her stomach. It was just afternoon when everything went wrong. Grace was in the kitchen making sandwiches for lunch when she heard a commotion from the elevator area. Julian appeared in the doorway, moving faster than she'd ever seen him move. "Grace, get in the safe room," he said, his voice calm but urgent. "Now." "What's happening?" Grace asked, but she was already moving, following Julian toward a door she'd never noticed before. "Tommy is in the building," Julian said, entering a code into a hidden panel. "He got past security somehow. Grace, listen to me very carefully. You go in here and you don't come out until I tell you it's safe." The door opened to reveal a small room that looked like something out of a spy movie. There were monitors showing security camera feeds, a phone, bottles of water, and what looked like enough supplies to last for days. "Julian, I'm not leaving you out there," Grace said, panic rising in her voice. "Yes, you are," Julian said firmly, guiding her into the room. "Grace, my job is to protect you. Your job is to stay safe so I can do mine. What if something happens to you?" Grace grabbed Julian's arm, suddenly terrified of being separated from him. Julian cupped her face in his hands, his green eyes intense and focused. "Nothing is going to happen to me. I have security protocols in place, I have people coming to help, and I have every reason in the world to make sure I come back to you." Before Grace could argue further, Julian kissed her hard and desperate, like he was trying to memorize the taste of her lips. "I love you," he said against her mouth. "Grace, I love you and I'm going to keep you safe." "I love you too," Grace whispered, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. Julian smiled, quick and fierce. "Then trust me." He stepped back and closed the safe room door, leaving Grace alone with the security monitors and her racing heart. Through the cameras, Grace could see Julian moving through the penthouse with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. She watched him check door locks, speak into a radio, and position himself between the elevator and the safe room where Grace was hidden. For 20 minutes nothing happened. Grace watched the monitors, seeing security guards moving through the building, seeing police cars arriving outside, seeing what looked like a coordinated effort to find Tommy and neutralize the threat. Then Grace saw him. Tommy appeared on one of the hallway cameras, looking wild-eyed and desperate. He was carrying something in his hand that Grace couldn't quite make out, and he was moving toward Julian's penthouse with single-minded determination. Grace grabbed the phone in the safe room and dialed Julian's number. "Grace, are you?" "He's coming up the stairs," Grace interrupted. "Julian, he's almost to your floor." "I see him," Julian said, his voice calm. "Grace, stay exactly where you are. Do not open that door no matter what you hear." "Julian." "Promise me," Julian said urgently. "Grace, promise me you won't open that door." "I promise," Grace whispered, though every instinct in her body was screaming at her to help somehow. Grace watched the monitors as Tommy reached Julian's floor and moved toward the penthouse. She could see Julian waiting by the elevator, and she could see the moment when Tommy realized the front door was locked. What happened next was chaos. Tommy started pounding on the door, screaming Grace's name and demanding that Julian let him in. Julian was talking into his radio, coordinating with security, staying calm even as Tommy's voice got more and more unhinged. Then Tommy produced what looked like a crowbar and started attacking the door itself. Grace watched in horror as the expensive wood began to splinter under Tommy's assault. Julian was still talking calmly into his radio, but Grace could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he was positioning himself to defend the penthouse. "Grace!" Tommy screamed, his voice audible even through the safe room's soundproofing. "I know you're in there. That bastard can't keep you from me." The front door finally gave way, and Tommy burst into the penthouse like a hurricane of rage and desperation. Grace watched on the monitors as he confronted Julian in the living room, the crowbar still in his hand. Grace couldn't hear what they were saying to each other, but she could see Julian's body language protective, alert, ready for anything. Tommy was gesturing wildly with the crowbar, clearly making threats, clearly unhinged. Then Tommy rushed at Julian. Grace screamed involuntarily as she watched the two men fight, Julian trying to disarm Tommy while Tommy swung the crowbar with vicious intent. Julian was bigger and obviously in better shape, but Tommy had the desperate strength of someone with nothing left to lose. The fight moved through the living room, destroying furniture and shattering the peaceful atmosphere Grace had come to associate with Julian's home. She watched Julian land a solid punch that sent Tommy staggering, watched Tommy recover and swing the crowbar in an arc that barely missed Julian's head. Finally, Julian managed to get the crowbar away from Tommy, pinning him to the ground just as security guards burst through the destroyed front door. Grace sagged against the wall of the safe room, relief flooding through her as she watched Tommy being handcuffed and dragged away. Julian was alive, Tommy was caught, and maybe this nightmare was finally over. When Julian opened the safe room door 15 minutes later, Grace threw herself into his arms with such force that she nearly knocked him over. "Are you hurt?" she asked, running her hands over his chest and arms, checking for injuries. "I'm fine," Julian said, holding her tight. "Grace, I'm fine. It's over." "Is he gone?" "He's gone," Julian confirmed. "Police have him, and this time he's not getting out." "Grace, you're safe now." Grace buried her face in Julian's chest, breathing in his familiar scent and letting herself feel truly safe for the first time in over a week. "Julian," she said softly. "Yeah. When you said you loved me earlier." "I meant it," Julian said without hesitation. "Grace, I've never meant anything more in my life." Grace pulled back to look at him, seeing the sincerity in his green eyes, the way he was looking at her like she was the most precious thing in his world. "I meant it too," she said. "Julian, I love you. Not because you protected me, not because of any of this craziness, but because of who you are." Julian's smile was radiant. "Does that mean you'll stay?" "Not because you have to, but because you want to." Grace considered the question, thinking about everything that had brought them to this moment. The fear, the danger, the gradual realization that Julian Sterling was nothing like what she'd expected. The way he cared about other people, the way he'd honored his parents' memory and his sister's dreams, the way he'd been willing to risk his own safety to protect hers. "I'll stay," Grace said. "But Julian, I have conditions." "Anything," Julian said immediately. "I want to go back to work," Grace said. "I want to keep being a nurse. And I want us to be partners, not protector and protected." Julian nodded seriously. "Done." "Grace, I don't want to control your life. I just want to be part of it. And I want to help with the free clinics," Grace continued. "Emma's clinics. I want to be involved in something that honors her memory." Julian's eyes filled with tears. She would have loved that idea. "Then we have a deal," Grace said, standing on her toes to kiss him. As Julian kissed her back, Grace realized that sometimes the most unexpected love stories were the most beautiful ones. She'd thought Julian was her captor, but he turned out to be her savior. She'd thought his world was too dangerous for her, but she was learning that love was worth any risk. And most importantly, she was learning that home wasn't a place, it was a person. And Julian Sterling had become her home. 6 months later, Grace stood in the bathroom of Julian's penthouse, their penthouse, now staring at her reflection in the mirror. She was wearing scrubs again, getting ready for her first day back at City General Hospital since the Tommy incident. The past 6 months had been a whirlwind of healing, learning, and falling deeper in love than Grace had ever thought possible. Julian had kept every promise he'd made to her. She'd been free to make her own choices, free to come and go as she pleased, free to rebuild her life on her own terms. The difference was that now she was choosing to share that life with Julian. "Ready for your first day back?" Julian asked, appearing in the bathroom doorway with a cup of coffee in his hand. "Nervous," Grace admitted, accepting the coffee gratefully. "It's been 6 months, Julian. What if I've forgotten how to be a nurse?" "Impossible," Julian said, kissing her temple. "Grace, nursing isn't something you do, it's something you are. You'll be fine." Grace smiled, feeling some of her nervousness ease. Over the past 6 months, Julian had become her anchor, her support system, her partner in every sense of the word. He'd never once tried to talk her out of going back to work, even though she knew he worried about her safety. "How's the new security system working out?" Grace asked, referring to the discreet protection measures Julian had put in place. "You won't even notice it," Julian promised. "Grace, I know you don't want to feel watched or controlled. But I need to know you're safe." Grace understood. Tommy was in prison, but Julian's other enemies were still out there. The compromise they'd reached, minimal but effective security that didn't interfere with Grace's daily life, had taken months to develop. But it was worth it for both their peace of mind. "And you'll pick me up after my shift?" Grace asked. "I'll be waiting in the parking lot," Julian confirmed. "Grace, I'm proud of you for going back. I know this isn't easy." Grace studied Julian's face, seeing the love and support there, but also something else. "You're worried about something." Julian hesitated, and Grace could see him debating whether to share whatever was on his mind. "Julian, we promised to be honest with each other about everything," Grace reminded him. "What's wrong?" "It's probably nothing," Julian said. "But my security team has been tracking some unusual activity around Sterling Medical Corporation. Nothing threatening, just strange." "What kind of strange?" "People asking questions about our free clinic program," Julian said. "About Emma's foundation specifically." "Grace, it might be nothing, but I wanted you to know." Grace felt a familiar flutter of anxiety, but it was manageable now. She'd learned to live with the reality that being with Julian meant being aware of potential threats, but she'd also learned that Julian's security team was exceptionally good at their jobs. "Do you think it's connected to me going back to work?" Grace asked. "Probably not," Julian said. "But Grace, if anything feels off today, anything at all, you call me immediately." "I will," Grace promised. "Julian, I can handle this. We can handle this." Julian smiled, the worry in his eyes easing. "You're right. We can handle anything together." Grace finished getting ready and they rode down to the parking garage together, where Julian's driver was waiting to take Grace to the hospital. It still felt strange being driven to work in a luxury car, but Grace had learned to accept the small compromises that came with loving someone in Julian's position. "I love you," Julian said, kissing her goodbye at the car. "I love you too," Grace replied. "Julian? Thank you for letting me do this." "Thank you for choosing to stay," Julian said. "Grace, you make everything better." The drive to City General Hospital was shorter than Grace remembered, and before she knew it, she was walking through the familiar halls of the ICU where she'd worked for 3 years before everything changed. "Grace." Nancy, her former supervisor, greeted her with a huge hug. "We've missed you so much. How are you feeling?" "Good," Grace said honestly. "Nervous but good. How are things here?" "Busy as always," Nancy said. "But Grace, we have some new equipment I think you're going to love. Sterling Medical Corporation donated a whole new set of monitoring systems last month." Grace smiled, knowing that Julian had arranged the donation specifically because he knew she was coming back to work. It was his way of making sure she had the best possible tools to do her job. The morning flew by as Grace reacquainted herself with hospital routines. It was like riding a bicycle. Within hours, she felt comfortable again, moving between patient rooms with the confidence that came from years of experience. During her lunch break, Grace called Julian. "How's your first day going?" he asked immediately. "Better than I expected," Grace said. "Julian, I forgot how much I love this job. Thank you for supporting me coming back." "You don't need to thank me for that," Julian said. "Grace, you're glowing when you talk about your patients. This is where you belong." Grace was about to respond when Nancy appeared at her elbow, looking concerned. "Grace, there's someone here asking for you," Nancy said quietly. Grace felt her stomach tighten. "What kind of someone?" "A woman," Nancy said. "She says she's from Emma's Foundation and she needs to speak with you about your work with the free clinics." Grace felt confused. She'd been volunteering with Emma's Foundation for months, but she'd never heard of anyone from the organization coming to the hospital to speak with volunteers. "I'll call you back," Grace told Julian, hanging up before he could respond. Grace followed Nancy to the visitors area, where a well-dressed woman in her 50s was waiting. She had kind eyes and a professional demeanor, but something about her presence felt off. "Grace Johnson?" the woman asked, standing up with a smile. "Yes," Grace said cautiously. "I'm Dr. Sarah Collins from Emma's Foundation," the woman said, extending her hand. "I was hoping we could talk about your volunteer work. Perhaps we could grab coffee?" Grace's training kicked in. Julian had taught her to be suspicious of unexpected requests, especially ones that involved leaving the hospital. "I'm sorry, but I'm working right now," Grace said politely. "Could you call the Foundation office to schedule a meeting?" Dr. Collins' smile faltered slightly. "Of course, but Grace, this is somewhat urgent. It's about expanding the free clinic program, and we need input from experienced nurses like yourself." "I'd be happy to help," Grace said, "but it will have to be through official channels." Grace could see frustration flicker across Dr. Collins' face, and alarm bells started going off in her head. Something about this woman didn't feel right. "I understand," Dr. Collins said, her voice slightly cooler now. "I'll be in touch through the proper channels." As soon as Dr. Collins left, Grace called Julian back. "Someone just came to the hospital claiming to be from Emma's Foundation," Grace said without preamble. "Julian, something felt wrong about her." "What do you mean?" Julian's voice was immediately alert. Grace described her interaction with Dr. Collins, including the woman's reluctance to go through official channels and the way her demeanor had changed when Grace refused to leave with her. "Grace, there is no Dr. Sarah Collins associated with Emma's Foundation," Julian said grimly. "Can you describe her?" Grace provided as much detail as she could remember, feeling increasingly uneasy about the encounter. "I'm sending security to the hospital now," Julian said. "Grace, I want you to stay exactly where you are until they arrive." "Do you think this is connected to the unusual activity you mentioned this morning?" Grace asked. "I think someone is very interested in Emma's Foundation, and they're using you to try to get information, Julian said. Grace, I'm coming to get you. Julian, my shift doesn't end for 4 hours, Grace protested. Your safety is more important than your shift, Julian said firmly. Grace, please. Let me come get you. Grace wanted to argue, wanted to insist that she could handle whatever this was. But the encounter with Dr. Collins had shaken her more than she wanted to admit, and the thought of Julian's protection was suddenly very appealing. Okay, Grace said. I'll talk to Nancy about leaving early. I'll be there in 20 minutes, Julian said. Grace, I love you. Stay safe. As Grace waited for Julian to arrive, she thought about how much her life had changed in the past year. 6 months ago, she would have been angry about Julian rushing to protect her. Now, she understood that his concern came from love, not control, and she was grateful to have someone who cared enough to drop everything when she needed help. When Julian arrived at the hospital, his relief at seeing her safe was obvious. He pulled her into his arms right there in the hospital lobby, not caring who was watching. Are you okay? He asked, running his hands over her arms like he was checking for injuries. I'm fine, Grace said. Julian, who do you think that woman was? I don't know yet, Julian said. But Grace, my security team is investigating. We'll figure out what this is about. As they left the hospital together, Grace realized that this was what love looked like when it was real. It wasn't about control or possession, it was about two people protecting each other, supporting each other's dreams, and facing whatever challenges came their way as a team. Grace had found her partner, and Julian had found his. Whatever threats were out there, they would handle them together. 1 year later, Grace stood in the garden of the Sterling Medical Corporation headquarters, watching Julian address a crowd of medical professionals, community leaders, and patients whose lives had been touched by Emma's Foundation. Today marks the 1-year anniversary of Emma's Foundation, Julian was saying, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd. In that time, we've opened 12 new free clinics, provided medical care to over 10,000 patients, and created a network of healthcare professionals dedicated to serving underserved communities. Grace smiled, thinking about how much had changed since that terrifying night when she'd been trapped at a bus stop in the rain. The past year had been full of challenges, but it had also been the happiest time of her life. The investigation into the fake Dr. Collins had revealed a competitor trying to steal information about Emma's Foundation's funding model. Julian's security team had handled the situation efficiently, and Grace had returned to work the next week without further incident. The experience had taught them both that they could face threats together and come out stronger. But Emma's Foundation isn't just about medical equipment or funding, Julian continued. It's about the people who make healthcare possible. People like Grace Johnson, our foundation's Director of Nursing Services. Grace felt her cheeks warm as Julian's eyes found hers in the crowd. When he'd offered her the position 3 months ago, she'd been hesitant to leave City General Hospital. But the opportunity to create nursing programs for underserved communities had been too good to pass up. Grace has helped us develop training programs for nurses in rural areas, mobile clinic services for homeless populations, and partnerships with nursing schools to provide scholarships for students who commit to working in free clinics, Julian said. Her vision and dedication have transformed what Emma's Foundation can accomplish. The crowd applauded, and Grace felt a surge of pride. She'd found a way to combine her passion for nursing with Julian's resources and vision, creating something that was making a real difference in people's lives. After Julian's speech, the reception moved inside to Sterling Medical Corporation's main conference center. Grace mingled with donors and healthcare professionals, talking about the foundation's work and sharing stories about the patients they'd been able to help. Grace, there's someone I'd like you to meet, Julian said, appearing at her elbow with an elderly woman Grace didn't recognize. Grace, this is Dr. Margaret Russo, Julian said. She worked with my parents when they first started Sterling Medical Corporation. Dr. Russo was tiny but fierce-looking, with sharp eyes and a warm smile. When she shook Grace's hand, her grip was surprisingly strong. So you're the nurse who tamed Julian Sterling, Dr. Russo said with a mischievous grin. I don't think anyone could tame Julian, Grace said, laughing. But I did convince him to let me keep my own apartment for 6 months before moving in with him. Smart woman, Dr. Russo said approvingly. Julian's parents would have liked you. They always said the company needed someone who understood that medicine is about people, not profits. Grace felt touched by the comparison. She'd learned so much about Julian's parents over the past year, and she knew how much their approval would have meant to him. Dr. Russo helped design the first Sterling medical heart monitor, Julian said. She's been watching our company grow for 30 years. And I've never seen Julian as happy as he's been this past year, Dr. Russo said, looking between Grace and Julian with obvious affection. Grace, you've given him something I wasn't sure he'd ever find. What's that? Grace asked. A reason to believe in love again, Dr. Russo said simply. As the evening wound down, Grace and Julian found themselves alone on the terrace outside the conference center, looking out over the city lights. Dr. Russo is wonderful, Grace said, leaning against Julian's side. I can see why your parents loved working with her. She helped me a lot after Emma died, Julian said quietly. When I was ready to shut down the foundation, she's the one who convinced me that Emma wouldn't want her death to stop us from helping people. Grace turned to look at Julian, seeing the peace in his expression when he talked about his sister now. The pain would always be there, but it had transformed into something purposeful, something that honored Emma's memory by continuing her work. I have something for you, Julian said suddenly, reaching into his jacket pocket. Grace's heart skipped as Julian pulled out a small velvet box. They'd talked about marriage, about their future together, but Grace hadn't expected a proposal tonight. Julian, Grace breathed, staring at the box. Grace, this past year has been the best of my life, Julian said, dropping to one knee right there on the terrace. You've taught me that love doesn't have to be dangerous, that opening your heart doesn't make you weak. You've helped me honor Emma's memory while building something beautiful together. Grace felt tears sliding down her cheeks as Julian opened the box to reveal a stunning but simple diamond ring. Grace Marie Johnson, will you marry me? Julian asked. Will you be my partner in everything, in love, in life, in making the world a little better than we found it? Yes, Grace whispered, then louder. Yes, Julian, of course I'll marry you. Julian slipped the ring onto her finger with shaking hands, then stood up to kiss her as the city sparkled around them. I love you, Julian said against her lips. Grace, I love you so much. I love you too, Grace said, admiring the way the ring caught the light. Julian, it's perfect. You're perfect, Julian said. Grace, you saved me. Not just from loneliness but from becoming someone I wouldn't have recognized. Someone my parents and Emma wouldn't have been proud of. Grace cupped Julian's face in her hands, looking into the green eyes that had become her favorite sight in the world. You saved me too, she said. Julian, you showed me what it looks like when someone loves you enough to protect you but respects you enough to let you choose your own path. They stood together on the terrace, holding each other and watching the city below. Grace thought about the journey that had brought them here, the fear, the misunderstandings, the gradual realization that they were perfect for each other despite all the reasons they shouldn't be. When do you want to get married? Julian asked. Soon, Grace said without hesitation. Julian, I don't need a big wedding or months of planning. I just need you. What about a small ceremony here at the foundation? Julian suggested. We could have it in Emma's garden with just our closest friends and family. Grace smiled, thinking about how perfect that would be. Emma's garden was where Julian had first told her about his sister, where they'd had their first real conversation about the foundation's work. It would be the perfect place to start their married life together. I think Emma would like that, Grace said. I think she would too, Julian agreed. Grace, I know this past year hasn't been easy. Dating someone in my position, dealing with security concerns, learning to navigate my world. Our world, Grace corrected. Julian, your world became our world the moment I decided to stay. And I wouldn't change any of it. Julian smiled, the expression lighting up his whole face. Not even the part where I kept you prisoner in my penthouse? Especially not that part, Grace said, laughing. Julian, if you hadn't been so overprotective and dramatic, we might have just dated normally and broken up when things got complicated. Instead, we were forced to really get to know each other, Julian said. To see each other at our worst and decide we wanted to stick around for our best. Grace thought about how true that was. She'd seen Julian when he was controlling and frightened, when his need to protect her had made him make decisions she couldn't forgive. But she'd also seen him when he was vulnerable and grief-stricken, when his love for his family had driven him to create something beautiful in their memory. And Julian had seen her when she was angry and scared, when his world had overwhelmed her and made her question everything she thought she wanted. But he'd also seen her when she was compassionate and strong, when her dedication to helping others had inspired him to be better than he thought he could be. I have one more surprise, Julian said, pulling out his phone. Grace, I got a call this afternoon from the nursing school at the university. They want to create a scholarship program in your name for students who want to work in underserved communities. Grace stared at Julian, overwhelmed by the gesture. Julian, that's incredible. But why in my name? Because you've shown that nursing isn't just a job, it's a calling, Julian said. Grace, You've inspired other nurses to get involved with the foundation, to see their work as part of something bigger. The scholarship program will help us train the next generation of nurses who share your values. Grace felt tears of joy sliding down her cheeks. A year ago she'd been struggling to pay her own student loans. Now she was going to help other nursing students pursue their dreams without the burden of debt. "Thank you," Grace whispered. "Julian, this is the most amazing gift you could have given me." "You've given me so much more," Julian said. "Grace, you've given me a future I actually want to live." As they headed inside to share their engagement news with their friends and colleagues, Grace reflected on the unexpected path that had brought them together. She'd thought Julian was a dangerous stranger when he'd first offered her a ride. She'd thought he was a controlling captor when he'd refused to let her leave his penthouse. She'd thought his world was too complicated and dangerous for someone like her. But Grace had learned that love didn't always make sense from the outside. Sometimes it looked like protection that felt like imprisonment. Sometimes it looked like control that was actually care. Sometimes it looked like a fairy tale that was really just two people choosing each other every day, even when it was hard. Julian Sterling had found her at a bus stop in the rain, but he'd given her so much more than just a ride home. He'd given her a purpose, a partnership, and a love that was strong enough to weather any storm. And Grace had given Julian something just as precious. She'd taught him that opening his heart didn't make him weak, it made him human. She'd shown him that love was worth the risk, that trust was possible even after loss, that the best way to honor the people you've lost is to keep living and loving and believing in the possibility of happiness. 6 months later, they were married in Emma's garden, surrounded by the people whose lives had been touched by their foundation's work. Grace wore a simple white dress and carried wildflowers from the garden. Julian wore his father's watch and his mother's wedding ring on a chain around his neck. As they exchanged vows under the same trees where Julian had first told Grace about his sister's dreams, Grace felt Emma's presence like a blessing. The young woman who had wanted to spend her life helping others would have loved seeing her foundation grow, seeing the love that had grown from her brother's grief transformed into something that was making the world better. "I promise to love you and support your dreams," Grace said, looking into Julian's eyes. "I promise to be your partner in all things, and to never let you forget that the best revenge against those who would hurt us is to live a life full of joy and purpose. I promise to protect you without controlling you," Julian said, his voice strong and sure. "I promise to trust you to make your own choices, and to choose you every day for the rest of my life." When they kissed as husband and wife, Grace felt like she was finally, completely home. Not in Julian's penthouse, not in any building or city, but in Julian's arms, in the life they'd built together, in the love that had grown from the most unlikely beginning. As their friends and family cheered around them, Grace thought about the woman she'd been a year and a half ago, tired, lonely, struggling to make ends meet, convinced that love like this only existed in movies. That woman never could have imagined that missing a bus in the rain would lead to the greatest adventure of her life. "Mrs. Sterling," Julian whispered against her ear as they swayed together during their first dance. "I love the sound of that," Grace whispered back, smiling up at her husband. "You know what I love?" Julian asked. "What?" "I love that we're going to spend the rest of our lives proving that the best love stories don't start with perfect circumstances," Julian said. "They start with imperfect people choosing to love each other perfectly." Grace laughed, feeling joy bubble up inside her like champagne. "You're getting very philosophical, Mr. Sterling." "It's what happens when you marry someone who makes you believe in happy endings," Julian said, spinning her around the dance floor. As the song ended and their guests applauded, Grace caught sight of a framed photo on the table nearby Emma, smiling brightly in her medical school graduation picture. Next to it was a small placard that read, "Emma's Foundation, Continuing the Dream." Grace squeezed Julian's hand, knowing that Emma would have loved this day, would have loved seeing her brother so happy, would have loved knowing that her dreams were living on through their work. "She's here," Grace said softly, nodding toward the photo. "She is," Julian agreed, his voice thick with emotion. "And Grace, I think she approves." As the reception continued around them, Grace and Julian stood together in Emma's garden, surrounded by the people they loved, looking toward a future bright with possibility. They had both learned that love wasn't always easy, that it sometimes required sacrifice and compromise and forgiveness. But they had also learned that when it was real, when it was right, love was worth fighting for. Grace had found her happily ever after in the most unexpected place, in the arms of a man who had once seemed like her captor but had turned out to be her greatest champion. And Julian had found his redemption in the love of a woman who had taught him that protecting someone didn't mean controlling them, and that the strongest love was built on trust, respect, and the freedom to choose. Together they would continue Emma's work, helping others while building a life filled with the kind of love that made every challenge worth facing. They would have disagreements and difficult days, moments when Julian's protective instincts clashed with Grace's independence, times when the pressures of their public life strained their private happiness. But they would face all of it together, as partners, as equals, as two people who had learned that the most beautiful love stories were the ones that began with the courage to trust a stranger on a stormy night. As their wedding guests began to leave and the evening settled into peaceful quiet, Grace and Julian sat together on a bench in Emma's garden, watching the stars appear in the darkening sky. "So," Julian said, taking Grace's hand and playing with her new wedding ring, "what do you think our life will look like in 10 years? Grace considered the question, thinking about all the dreams they'd shared, all the plans they'd made for expanding the foundation and growing their family. "I think we'll have at least 2 kids who are as stubborn as both of us," Grace said, laughing. "I think Emma's foundation will be operating in every state. I think you'll have convinced me to let you buy me a house with a real garden where I can grow vegetables." "What else?" Julian asked, smiling at the picture she was painting. "I think we'll still have security concerns and complicated schedules and the occasional crisis that tests our patience with each other," Grace said honestly. "But Julian, I think we'll also have something most people spend their whole lives looking for." "What's that?" "A love story worth telling," Grace said, leaning against Julian's shoulder. "A marriage built on respect and trust and the absolute certainty that we're better together than we ever were apart." Julian kissed the top of Grace's head, breathing in the scent of her hair mixed with the flowers blooming around them. "I love you, Grace Sterling," he said softly. "I love you too, Julian Sterling," Grace replied. "Thank you for finding me in that storm. Thank you for getting in my car despite every reason you shouldn't have," Julian said. As they sat together in the garden that honored Emma's memory while celebrating their future, Grace realized that their story had become exactly what she'd always hoped love could be: not perfect, but real. Not easy but worth it. Not a fairy tale but something even better. A partnership built on choice, strengthened by challenge and deepened by the knowledge that they had both found exactly what they'd been looking for in the most unexpected place. Thank you so much for taking this journey with Grace and Julian. Their story shows us that love doesn't always arrive the way we expect it to, and sometimes the most beautiful relationships grow from the most challenging circumstances. What did you think about Grace's initial reaction to Julian's protection? Do you believe Julian's actions were justified given the real threats they faced? And most importantly, what moment in their love story touched your heart the most? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Did you see yourself in Grace's determination to maintain her independence, or in Julian's desperate need to protect the people he loves? What would you have done in Grace's situation when she first realized she was essentially being held for her own safety? Also, which secondary character would you like to see get their own love story? Emma's foundation has brought so many people together. Maybe there's another romance waiting to bloom in that world. Your comments and feedback mean everything to authors, so please share your thoughts, favorite quotes, or even just tell us how this story made you feel. Love stories are meant to be shared, and your engagement helps these characters live on beyond the final page.